So, verse 1 says, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him, and a man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Whew, there's a lot in here. Because, again, and I think I shared this earlier, when you're studying the Bible, don't just gloss through things like this. A man with leprosy, who was this man? What can we tell about this man that he would come and kneel before Jesus? Where was he? Was he part of the crowd? He couldn't have been because he had leprosy. And those people who had leprosy had to go research it, because Leviticus 13:45-46 shows how people with leprosy were treated back in these days. If you look at it, verse 45 says, anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. Let their hair be unkempt. Cover the lower part of their face. And they need to cry out, unclean, unclean. Can you imagine this man? Because when we just read a man with leprosy came and knelt before him, we can just gloss past it. But this man wasn't born with leprosy. He experienced what I like to call a defining moment at some point in his life. He was normal, he was clean at some point. All of a sudden had a defining moment where he began to observe something was growing on his skin. Is it possible that he initially thought it was a rash? Oh, it's going to go soon. But all of a sudden, 1 week goes by, 2 weeks goes by, and the thing begins to spread. Imagine he had a job. The culture back then was, if you have a skin disease, you are not allowed to mix with others. Exactly. So now he's getting worried. Like what does this mean? Is he trying to hide it at some point? Like hopefully nobody sees it. He once had a life. And all of a sudden he gets this infectious disease that renders him unclean to the people around him. Probably lost his family. Right? Probably lost his job. Because it says that as long as they had that disease, they remained unclean. They had to live alone and they had to live outside the camp. So you can imagine what this man has been dealing with. He's not just dealing with a physical ailment. He's also dealing with an emotional ailment. Not just emotional, spiritual, because he couldn't worship with other people as well. He couldn't go into the temple to worship because he had this infectious disease. And so imagine this man. He's having to wear torn clothes. Imagine being rejected. Everywhere he goes, he has to shout, unclean, unclean. And as soon as he says that, everybody is just running away from him. Can you imagine what he's dealing with mentally? What he has had to deal with mentally for years. The Bible doesn't tell us how long he had dealt with this issue. But can you imagine having to deal with that? He had to live alone. He had to stay in isolation. Imagine the people in prison who have to go into isolation. You can't even interact with people. Maybe the only other people you can interact with are other people who have leprosy as well. And so just imagine, all his dreams and aspirations had gone away. This man couldn't get married. This man couldn't have children. He was hopeless. There was no cure. Imagine living a life like this. Then all of a sudden, the man begins to hear of people who were like him, but have now received their healing. Remember, prior to this in Matthew chapter 4, as soon as Jesus came down from fasting in the wilderness and he had received power, he begins to heal people with diseases and people who are sick. And people also bring the paralytic people who are demon possessed to him. And so this man begins to hear of a man who has the power to take sicknesses away, to take diseases away. And so you can imagine this man whose hopes and aspirations have been dashed for years. It suddenly begins to revive. He's like, I need to see this man. Is it possible that he finally finds Jesus, but he sees Jesus, teaching a crowd of people? The place is quiet. Remember, if he needs to get into any situation where people are, he needs to shout, unclean, unclean. Is it possible he sees Jesus like, man, this is the man who has my healing, but I can't go to him now because if I have to go through the crowd and shout, unclean, unclean, I may disrupt his message. And so he's patiently waiting, possibly. Patiently waiting. I don't want to interrupt his message. But as soon as he's done and I have an opportunity, I'm going to grab it. And so chapter 8 verse 1, it says, after Jesus had finished preaching and he comes down from the mountain, large crowds are still following him. And they're probably following behind him because, they don't know where Jesus is going next. So they are waiting for him to take the lead. And as he's walking, it says a man with leprosy came and knelt before him. Now you see that the picture behind this scripture is now different. You're not just seeing a regular man now. Now you're seeing a man who, and you can imagine like he's coming close to Jesus. As he's coming close to Jesus, you can imagine the crowd. They're stepping back. Like, we don't know what's going to happen here. We don't want to be infected. We know that Jesus has power, but you know what? Let Jesus deal with this. And so it's possible that this man and Jesus are alone. But then this man comes and kneels before him. I think that is significant. Number one, he comes close. He has never been able to come close to anyone in a while. This is the first person that he is feeling confident enough to come close to him. Is he even, I think someone said it, that is he even scared that is Jesus going to reject him like every other person has? But he comes close and Jesus doesn't reject him and he kneels before him. And I love what he says, because Jesus had just been preaching about Father, Father, but here he calls him Lord. Jesus had just been teaching. Somebody observing him would have seen him as a teacher. But this man recognized that Jesus was Lord. The root meaning of that word Lord means supreme in authority. So he understood that Jesus wasn't a regular man. Jesus had supreme authority because diseases and sicknesses were listening to him. They weren't just listening, they were obeying because they had to leave. It's one thing for a disease to listen, it's another thing for it to obey your word. So he understood that Jesus had supreme authority. And guess what? He knelt down, exactly, Kemi, to signify, I'm submitting to your authority. Number one, he calls him Lord, which means I recognize your authority. He now kneels down to symbolize that I'm submitting to your authority. And then what he says is very, very, very significant because it's very instructive for us today. He says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. This is the correct arrangement. He didn't just say, God, you can. He said, if you are willing, if it is in your will, then you can. The mistake a lot of us make today is that we believe what God cannot exist, what God cannot do does not exist. And it's true. But what God will not do does exist. Because the fact that God can do something doesn't mean that he will do it. This man said, Lord, if you are willing, you can. What we need to do today, whenever we are praying for something, we first need to understand if it is God's will before we now begin to trust him for if he can do it. And I'm going to give you scriptural backing for this. Let me show you. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6. I know there's a popular, what God cannot do does it is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. What God cannot do does not exist, but what he will not do does exist. Let me show you. 1 Samuel 14, verse 6. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Are you seeing this? He said perhaps, not that, oh, let's go over because God can do it. He said perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all that you have in mind. His armor bearer said, "Go ahead, I'm with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." That will be the sign that God will do it, not can do it. They knew God can do with a few, with more. God can do anything. But we need to know if God will do it now. So, this man, let's go back to Matthew 8. So this man came with the right approach, because he had to ask him, "Lord, number one, are you willing? Because if you are willing, I know you can." We need to ask if God is willing. Is it in God's will? Because the mistake a lot of us make is like going to an Apple store. I don't know why I like using Apple as, because I'm a Samsung guy. It's like going to a Samsung store and asking for an Apple product. A lot of us are asking for Samsungs or Apple in a Samsung store. You need to know if what you're asking for is in the will of God. People are asking for things that God has never even promised. Because we're just praying our will now. God, this man said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And that's what humility is. Bringing it back to us now. Because just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. Just because you can afford something doesn't mean you should buy it. Just because Jesus could heal everybody didn't mean that he would. Because he was submitted to his Father. Think about it. When Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted, he could turn the stone to bread. He can do it. But he didn't. Because he wasn't in alignment with the will of God at that point in time. He could have thrown himself from the mountain. But we need to understand, is it God's will for us? It was my wife that got me into this revelation a few years ago, because I'm Nigerian. When I moved back to Nigeria at some point, I was like the senior advocate of Nigeria. Like, I was always like, this country is going to work. This country is going to get better. Like, God can do it. God can do it. And my wife stopped me one day and she's like, "Can God change the country? Yes. Will he?" And I paused. Because she said, "Will he break his principles just to save this country? Will he?" And that switched my mindset. Because I'm like, you can't be doing the wrong things and expect God to bless it. God will not break his principles, will not break his word just to bless you. Things have to be done in the proper way. Can God do it? Yes. Will he do it? That's a different question. Whew. But Jesus then responded. Imagine everybody, oh my, like, imagine the last time this man got touched by anybody. Everybody has been running away from him. Jesus, after he hears this man saying, are you willing? Because if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reaches out and touches the man. Whew. This is the first time he's being touched in a while. And Jesus assures him, says, I am willing. Be clean. And it says immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. How did he feel? How did he feel? Why was Jesus willing here? Remember something he said in his sermon, blessed are the poor in spirit. This man was poor in spirit. He wasn't just poor physically, he was poor in spirit. He knew that he did not deserve the healing. And so he says, I'm willing. And there's a lot to go in here, but I don't, like, time has gone. If I stay here, we're not going to go through the chapter, right? Jesus recognized that this man was poor in spirit. And so he filled him up. He enriched him. And immediately he was cleansed. The same way with us. We are the lepers in this story. Jesus is calling out to everyone. You are unclean, but I can make you clean. A lot of people want to clean themselves before they come to Jesus. And I think I mentioned it here before. Nobody takes a shower before they take a bath. And I feel like that's how, like, you come to Jesus to be clean. You don't clean yourself before you come to him. Imagine this man was trying to, package himself like, oh, I'm clean, like I don't need help. He would have walked past. But we come to him with our dirt so that the water of his word can wash us clean. I feel like he must have felt born again at this point. He wasn't born again, but imagine all his dreams and aspirations that had died suddenly began to resurrect. He couldn't get married before because he was considered unclean. Nobody would come close to him. Now, the dream of being married again is coming. He couldn't start a business, couldn't work, he couldn't worship, he couldn't do all these things. All of a sudden, now that the leprosy is gone, those dreams are being revived and resurrected. Their dreams are coming back to life. You can imagine how excited he is. And yet, in his excitement, Jesus then says to him, see that you don't tell anyone. Oof. I can't imagine, man. I'm like, God, all the people that have run away from me, all the people that have mocked me, I want to go tell them. Jesus says, make sure you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Again, when I was studying this, I just imagined the priest seeing this man. You can imagine, like, is it possible that the priest that inspected him, because the priest had to inspect you to see if you had the kind of infectious disease that needed you to be isolated. So imagine the priest who inspected him is like, man, this guy's a goner, man. Like, there's no way. Like, just, you need to move out. You need to... And then the priest sees this man healed. It's like, how? Like, how did this happen? It's like, there's a man named Jesus. So you can imagine, I feel like this was strategic, where Jesus was like, go and meet the priest, because he wanted the priests as well to be aware that there is an authority in town. Because the priest would eventually be part of the people who would execute him. Remember, Jesus came to die. He didn't come to live. He came to die. So even with all what he's doing right now, he's setting up his death, because he needed the Jews and the priests and all those people to become angry enough to want to execute him, because he came to die for our sins. And so you can imagine the priest at this point is like, this is odd. The only times we've heard of people with leprosy getting healed was Miriam, Moses' sister, and Naaman. It's like, what sort of authority has come? Anyway, let's not dwell on this, because I can stay on this for like 2 hours. Anyway, so Jesus heals this man. You can imagine the crowd behind him. They are like, what? Like, this man. And plus, remember in the sermon, he had told them, if you do good deeds, don't let anybody know. So is it possible that he's also, applying that word, that I've just healed someone, but like keep it quiet. At the same time, he didn't want a lot of people he didn't want a large enough crowd that would cause a problem to Rome. It wasn't his time yet. He already had a crowd. If people had heard that a man with leprosy, considered ceremonially unclean for life, has just received healing, that would have exploded the crowd even more. Thanks for watching. If you love this clip and you've been searching for a way to study the Bible to receive revelation and not just to gain information, I'm currently doing a live Bible study session every single day between 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I show you how you can begin to discover the things that God has hidden underneath what is written. Our biggest advantage today is revelation, because revelation is what makes our prayers more effective. Revelation is what gives us direction. It is what empowers us to see things and opportunities that most people miss. And so definitely check it out. We're currently studying the books of Genesis. We're going to move on to the 4 Gospels, Acts, and then the book of Romans. I'm hoping to see you guys later today. Take care. Thanks for watching again. Bye-bye.